Hi book lovers. I was really excited to see that Curious Cat over on her booktube channel is hosting a readathon for this month called Neurovember. She's basically focusing on all things neurology, but particularly with a focus on neurodivergence, so autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, OCD, Tourette's, learning disabilities. Apologies if I've missed any out. I'm sure there are a few more. It's really good to see a readathon focused on this, so I wanted to dedicate some of my reading to that this month. Curious Cat has done a huge bingo board with lots of prompts on. Some of them can be combined. I'm not going to focus too much on all of the prompts today because I'm not going to try and hit all of them with my reading, but do head over to her channel and check that out if you want to kind of really try and take part and hit all of those prompts in your own reading, or just look for some ideas. She's created a PDF document with lots of recommendations, lots of different takes on the prompts. So that can be really good if you're looking to broaden your reading this month. So Neurovember, the main prompts that I'm going to personally be looking at will be nonfiction, memoir, fiction by autistic authors, and fiction for children, which is either by autistic authors and or has autistic characters, and also neurodivergence more broadly. Particularly, I think I'll be looking at ADHD, dyslexia, and dyspraxia. There are a couple of more tangential prompts that I'm going to try and hit, which I'll look at, and that is looking at other types of species mind, looking at physical difference, so physical disability, as well as neurodivergence. And I'm also going to give a couple of honorary mentions that aren't from the prompts that I've just I'm reading myself this month and think could be possibly adjacent to this readathon. So first of all, I'm going to look at memoir. Now, my recommendation for this, if you haven't read it, would be a book called Odd Girl Out. Now, I can't remember the name of the author. I will put a picture of it on the screen. I first read this when I was first diagnosed with ASD, and I found it fantastic. I really related to it. It's a short read, but a very intense, informative, entertaining read. I think particularly if you're a woman with a late diagnosis, you will really resonate with this book. But even if you just want to find out more about neurodivergence, to find out more about neurodivergence in women, or to just read a really good memoir, that it's really quite pacey, really is a good read. I can definitely recommend that one. For my own reading this month, I'm going to start off with Strong Female Character by Fern Brady. Fern is a young, late diagnosed autistic woman who is now a comedian, and she writes a funny but darkly funny memoir about her early life and her youth, and I'm really looking forward to digging into this. Fern talks about being diagnosed later in life, having what she describes as a terrible Catholic childhood, homelessness, sex work, a nervous breakdown, finally getting into university and struggling with it due to her as yet undiagnosed autism. So this looks like a really interesting, if intense, and also darkly funny read. So I'm really looking forward to this. Another memoir that I've picked up and would probably hit quite a few of the prompts for Neurovember is Earthed by Rebecca Schiller. This follows a memoir of a woman who goes to live in the country on a small plot of land, and so it's in many ways a nature memoir. It's also a motherhood memoir. This is her first year of motherhood also in this book, but she also starts to struggle with her mental health and then finds out that she actually has ADHD, and so it's her journey of her story with an ADHD diagnosis also. This is also available in America under a different title, I'm not sure. So if you're an American and you'd like to pick this up locally, you're looking for Rebecca Schiller. And this looks like a really interesting read. Different to Strong Female Character, but also a really powerful looking memoir of neurodivergence. Then for non-fiction, I'm going to recommend, and this could also sort of fit in the memoir category, I'm going to recommend Diary of a Young Naturalist by Dara McNulty. Again, for all of you nature writer, nature memoir lovers, this is a great book. Dara is a young autistic guy. He's only a teenager who wants to be a naturalist, and this is his nature diary, and it's just a fantastic read from the point of view of both nature memoir and neurodivergence, and the fact that he's so young and just writes so beautifully and so intensely about the environment and the local landscape, I think this is a really staggering work. It's really beautiful. I'm also going to recommend, and I'm only halfway through this, so I'm going to finish this month as part of this readathon, Autism and Buddhist Practice, how Buddhism can help autistic adults cultivate well-being. Now, I'm not a Buddhist, but I do practice mindfulness and meditate, or at least attempt to meditate. That's not always that easy for people with neurodivergence, and this book really delves into that. It's an anthology, so written by lots of different autistic adults about their experience of meditation and mindfulness, and ways that they found to adapt that practice in ways that can really help their autism and sort of tangential symptoms of it, autism, such as, for example, anxiety and also trauma. This is a really interesting book. Like I said, I'm about halfway through, and it's one that I don't really see mentioned very often. I don't think it's very well known. So this would be my definite recommendation for nonfiction. Again, as I said, you don't have to be Buddhist or even interested necessarily in Buddhism to read this, but I think it's also a really good look at different accounts from autistic people and how their minds work and the struggles that they face. So for autistic authors, I have a few books I'm reading this month, and I would also recommend their authors. First of all is India Holton's new release, The Ornithologist's Field Guide to Love. This is set in a sort of Victorian fantasy world. It's magical realism, also romance. And it follows a main character who's an ornithologist, and she's looking for a magic bird, and she has a rivalry with a male ornithologist. So there's a little bit of light academia in there as well. India Holton also writes I'm not sure the name of the series, but it contains the League of Gentlewomen Witches, which is a fantastic book. They're all, I believe, set in either the Regency or Victorian period, all have touches of magical realism. Some of the characters are coded neurodivergent. Really interesting reads, really fun, quite light as well. Another author I'd recommend who has come out as autistic is Brandon Sanderson. I've only just started getting into Brandon Sanderson. The first book I read of his quite recently was The Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England. Now, I haven't seen this really recommended as an entry point. I picked it up because I seen it at the library. But I thought this was fantastic. It's a funny read. It's kind of sci-fi / fantasy. It's set in a sci-fi world where people can opt to go on holidays to alternate universes. And this guy wakes up finding himself in an alternate medieval England without knowing how he got there. And it's kind of part thriller, part sci-fi, with a little touch of romance as well, maybe. It's very funny, but also it has some quite deep things to say, I think, about human relationships and dynamics in relationships. It reminded me a little bit of Terry Pratchett, I think. It's not Pratchett, it's not Discworld. I'm a huge Pratchett fan, and nothing, in my opinion, can ever compare to him, but I thought it had similar vibes. So I think if you're a Pratchett fan and you've not read this, you'd probably enjoy it. It's a standalone as well, so you can read it without having read any of Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere series. What I will be reading from Brandon Sanderson this month is my first Cosmere novel, and I think this is quite often recommended as an entry point to his work, and that's Tress of the Emerald Sea, which follows a young girl who goes off, I believe, to save a friend. I'm not sure if it turns into a love interest, but she goes off to save her friend Charlie, and she goes off on a sea journey, and it's set in the universe of Cosmere, where Brandon Sanderson sets many of his series. I believe he has two main series, Mistborn and the Stormlight Archive, and I'm planning on making my way through those next year. That's going to be one of my 2025 reading goals. This looks like a really fun read. I believe it's crossover with YA, so quite a light read and suitable for kind of most ages as well. So that would also be suitable, I think, for potentially children's fiction by an autistic author. Other children's fiction that I would recommend, I don't have copies for, so I'll put pictures on the screen. Anything by Evie McDonald? Is it McDonald? I'm not sure. But she writes a kind of spark. Evie Nichols. McNichols? I'll put it on the screen. She writes a kind of spark, which is very popular, which features an autistic main character. It's recently been made into a TV series. But I'm going to personally recommend Like a Charm, which features a dyspraxic main character, which is a neurodivergence we don't see so much of in fiction. And this involves a girl who finds out that she has magical powers and that her family have magical powers and that there's a parallel magical world to this one, and it's a great read. It's also a good look at dyspraxia and how it can affect young people. For children's fiction, I'm also going to recommend a book called The Boy with the Butterfly Mind, which is a good look at a character with ADHD, a boy in this case. And it's also a more realistic storyline in that it deals with real life. A lot of fiction that features, I think, main characters with neurodivergence tends to go down the sort of superhero route, so sort of your Percy Jackson kind of plotline, and they're great and fantastic. But I also think that it's good for representation, and it's good for children themselves to read things with more realistic plot lines, particularly if they're looking to find relatability for themselves. And The Boy with the Butterfly Mind is one that I would definitely recommend. It follows a young boy with ADHD who's having family problems. There's divorce and remarrying in his family, and it involves him coming to terms with things around that, and is a really good look at how ADHD, particularly hyperactive ADHD, can affect young boys and young children. So they would be my recommendations for children's fiction. There are many, many more. Please do drop them in the comments if you have some favourites of your own. Children's fiction is becoming more and more diverse these days, which is a great thing, and we're seeing some great neurodivergence representation, which I think is fantastic. If you'd like to read a classic by a possible autistic author, and I just want to add this caveat that I'm not really a fan of post-diagnosing authors that have passed away. We can never know whether they're autistic or not, and so I don't know that I'm particularly happy with this kind of drive to claim past authors. However, if you would like to read a suspected autistic author so that you can read a classic for November, I would recommend Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. There's a lot of discourse online, and there's been a lot of ink spilled on whether or not Emily Bronte was potentially neurodivergent. Wuthering Heights is a great book. It's fairly short, so if you're quite new to the classics, it's a good one. It is very intense. I would check the trigger warnings for it. So it discusses abuse, domestic violence, childhood trauma, neglect, animal abuse as well. Lots of cruelty. So it is a dark book. It is an intense book. When I was a child, I think possibly because of the Kate Bush song and because of Cliff Richard playing Heathcliff, I always thought Wuthering Heights was a love story until I read it much later on. This is not a love story. There is a secondary romance in the book. But Cathy and Heathcliff, yes, they're in love, but this is a dark book. It's a dark book. It's not a romance. So a word of warning if you do try this. There are also some prompts that are a little broader than just looking at neurodivergence. And there are a couple of those that I want to try and hit this month. One was looking at the minds of other species, so animal minds. So of course you can read non-fiction for that. But I've had a book on my shelf for a while that I've been looking for an excuse to pick up. And that is Remarkably Bright Things by Shelby Van Pelt, where the main character is an octopus. And the octopus helps the human main character come to terms with her son's death. And I think there's also a bit of a mystery plot. And so I'm really excited about the idea of reading a book from the point of view of an octopus. I think that looks really interesting. That's going to be my pick for this. And then another prompt is to read a book that looks at physical differences, so sort of disability. My recommendation for that would be Some of Us Just Fall by Polly Atkins, which is another nature memoir by a woman who has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And I'm recommending that for two reasons. One, because Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which I have, is a disability which is often comorbid with neurodivergence. And so that fits in well and also helps raise awareness because EDS is quite rare and many people have never heard of it. Also because I think we need more nature memoirs from people with disabilities. A lot of nature writing, obviously stresses the joys of walking and climbing and hiking. And while these things are wonderful, they're not accessible to lots of people. So for me, more nature memoirs that address issues of accessibility and teach people about nature and how to enjoy nature without the need to be physically able, I think are important. So that would be my recommendation. The book I'm going to read this month for that is Get a Life, Chloe Brown. It's also great for BIPOC representation and BIPOC authors. And the main character in this has fibromyalgia, which is a chronic pain condition. And that's a focus of the plot. I'm really excited to read that one as well. It's another one I've had on my shelf quite a long time. So it'll be good to get to that. I also want to give an honorary mention and recommendation, not for this particular work, but for the author, to Terry Pratchett. There's also been a lot of discourse online as to whether or not Terry Pratchett was himself autistic. He never said that he was. I believe he was asked about it in an interview, and he said that to his knowledge, he wasn't. So I don't think we can, it's not right to claim him as an autistic author. However, I'm giving him an honorary mention because I know that he is beloved, and his Discworld science fiction series is beloved by many people, not just neurodivergent people, but I noticed that he comes up a lot in neurodivergent community discourse. I think a lot of us saw ourselves and the way our mind works in Discworld in a lot of Sir Terry Pratchett's characters, and the Discworld is a fantastic place to escape if you're struggling with the neurotypical world. So I definitely recommend Terry Pratchett. There are various different starting points for his work. Some people recommend some books, some recommend others. My recommendation would be Weird Sisters, which is a kind of spoof of Macbeth, but you don't need to be familiar with Macbeth to enjoy it. It's a good dive into the world of Discworld. It's the 6th Discworld book. It introduces some of his, in my view, best characters. Other books that people recommend as starting points would be Guards. So the sub-series in Discworld, there's the Witches sub-series, which Weird Sisters is technically the second one, but kind of the first. So one of the witches turns up in an earlier book called Equal Rights, but the 3 witches, they kind of come together in Weird Sisters. Guards is the first in the Night Watch sub-series, which is probably, I would say it's a close favourite with the witches for me. Some of his best work, I think, is in the Watch series, and Guards would be the first there, and also Mort, which is his 4th book, and which features Death as a character, and Death takes an apprentice, and it's a fantastic read. I'm going to be reading this month Terry Pratchett, A Stroke of the Pen, The Lost Stories, and this is a collection of short stories that Terry Pratchett wrote and or had published when he was very young. So this is probably one for the die-hard fans. I wouldn't recommend something like this as an entry point to his work. But if you're a fan of Terry Pratchett, this just looks fantastic. And again, I'm really excited to get to this. So that's going to be my Neurovember. I really hope that you will give Neurovember a go. If you only pick up one book about neurodivergence, or one book by a neurodivergent author or with a neurodivergent main character, it really helps us. It really helps awareness. It really helps representation.